Okay, so the first thing is that, and Bonson was very forward to point this out. But the first thing is that when you're making a transcendental critique about worldviews, the only worldviews on the table are the actual Christian worldview and the actual instantiation of autonomy. Meaning, it would just be pluralism. It would just be an autonomous worldview to suggest that you need to refute all of these other worldviews as if those are possible alternatives.
Right. So what we're not saying is we're not saying that we have a single proof that somehow exhausts all autonomous worldviews. We know all autonomous worldviews are false given revelation. What we're saying is that when we're in a discussion, we're only presented with two worldviews that are being argued.
That is the nature of the argument. The nature of the argument is to compare and contrast the worldview of the Christian who's defending his position and the worldview of the person who's saying, I don't need Christianity. I can be autonomous. I'm independent of Christian theology. In other words, what Bonson was quick to point out over, I think, a lot of other. It's not that other people don't. It's not that other defenders of Van Tillian apologetics don't say the same thing. It's just that Bonson was very. He mentions this idea a lot that because of the topic, because you're not making a transcendental critique about, say, whether or not it's raining, but rather you're making a transcendental critique about a person's worldview, and so those beliefs in virtue of which they believe everything else, and in virtue of which they live their entire life. There is no third man present. There is no alternative. There's just the two worldviews that are presented. The one that is supposed to actually instantiate autonomy, and the one that is supposed to actually instantiate theonomy.
Right. So I think there was something similar to an explanation of that in the Butler article, where
Yes.
Bonson, but it seemed that Michael Butler suggested that if that was the objection, then there was still somehow a problem for Tag, which I didn't exactly get. But Bonson, I think the way he framed it was that Bonson had that objection, but that was only a dialectical objection and not an epistemic objection. But I guess it wouldn't be an issue. It's not an issue for epistemology to not have the argument for the exhaustive, that exhausts all autonomous worldviews. Surely God tells us. So we have epistemic warrant for the belief that all autonomous worldviews are absurd. So I guess that's what satisfies the epistemic condition. But I think Butler was saying, well, if we don't have this argument that does exhaust all autonomous worldviews, that refutes them all by refuting this concept of autonomy, then it seems that we aren't doing the epistemic duty. Is that? Do you think that's what Butler is saying?
So not exactly. So I agree with your point that, yeah, once you have revelation, you have an epistemic ground to rule out all other worldviews. But I think in terms of argumentation, why would we grant that autonomy is possible? See, that's the problem. Is the only way you could go about showing the rationality of a non-Christian framework is by presenting it, is by possessing it, is by putting it on the table and saying, look, I can answer the problem of induction. Look, I can answer the problem of deduction. Like I can give you an account of the reliability of our sensory faculties, etc., and survive scrutiny, basically. There is no such thing as let's gratuitously accept that autonomy is possible and then try to figure out why it's not. That is the very thing that's on the table in question. How do you know that you can even begin to survey different worldviews without taking the Christian God for granted? Okay, so let me just clarify, because these are not two separate points. The original point that I'm making is when you've made the transcendental challenge, The question is, how do you know that anything is possible? How do you establish that any life is livable? What is the basis for what's the theory of reality that makes all of this rational? Any answer to that question is already going to be presupposed in your answer. It's already going to form the basis for you to even start talking about this stuff. Whoever is right in answering that question has the very answer that their opponent needs to even doubt it. So it is a very subtle way of begging the question to suggest that it's possible to be autonomous. Therefore, the Christian ought to offer us some kind of standalone proof why it's not.
So what we might say then is that the way in which the conversation might go something like this, where the question is, well, on what grounds do you reject the second premise? Because that's where they're rejecting this. The not autonomy. On what grounds do you reject that premise? And they're going to say, well, you haven't provided us the proof that all autonomous worldviews are false. So they're arguing that it's an unjustified premise. The issue being that in doing so, they are just assuming the very thing that they're trying to prove. They are assuming that autonomy is coherent in order to reject that premise.
Yes, and let me be very clear. It is perfectly valid to ask why premise 2 is justified. To investigate that and then to raise objections if you want to. What is not valid is to assume that it's unjustified from the outset. And I think people even Michael Martin makes a lot of mistakes, but he understands that really the only way to respond to Van Tillian Christianity is with a transcendental argument for the non-existence of the Christian God. It's terrible, but at least it's valid, right? That's the key thing, is most people don't even come up with a valid response. They just beg the question.
I don't know. I don't really, when I listen to his argument on, miracles, seems kind of fishy.
Well, it's valid in the sense that it's the right response. It's not valid in the sense that the premise or the conclusion follows from the premises.
My point is, that's exactly right. My point is that if you didn't respond transcendentally, then you haven't even begun in the right area. I mean, it's like somebody it's like when somebody's arguing for something and they're offering a logically fallacious argument, right? Like, you don't even have to worry about the soundness of their argument because they haven't even offered a valid one yet.
Right. And it is kind of bizarre to ask that question, I guess. Like, well, how do you justify premise 2? It's like, well, wait a minute. That's the very question being asked. What is justification? What does that even mean to say? How is that distinguishable from its negation on your worldview?
Right. The thing is, they're taking for granted that justification could be something that we could even talk about before taking Christianity for granted. But in the nature of the case, let's say you're talking to a transcendental idealist. Like, okay, what justification is going to be characterized by a transcendental idealist model of justification, so that when you judge that question, that would just be the criteria that you use to decide whether or not we've actually offered justification. But if the Christian worldview is right, then the Christian model of epistemology is the one that you're going to use to decide whether or not the justification we've offered is suitable. There's no way to play this question-begging game of hand me my autonomy for a moment so that I can judge whether or not you've given me an argument.
I think a lot of times it comes from that a lot of people don't think about these things in the sense of worldviews in that way. They don't think about what a worldview means and what it means to what we're questioning. Like they think it's just like any other argument. Like if it's raining outside, they don't see the implications
Right.
of the worldview, and in doing so, they kind of take on what they think to be this kind of like neutral worldview, where it's like, well, we just assume that logic works. We just assume that we can have justification. We assume all these things arbitrarily, and we don't really have any ground for them at all.
Right. And then in the words of Rupert Sheldrake, if you give me a miracle and I'll explain the entire universe. Like that's I mean that's great, but if we have to take for granted what's and the irony, the sad irony of it all is that this is usually what the apologist is accused. Or this is the fallacy the apologist is accused of committing, that of question begging, right? That you're just taking for granted the Christian worldview, when really the question is loaded when they say, okay, well, what's the justification for premise 2? Well, that's a good question. If you're actually asking, what is the justification? If what you're really asking is, well, why should I believe that this is justified until you provide me some answer? Then you're just presuming that you have a credible epistemological stance on which to be neutral to this argument.
It's almost as if it would be like somebody trying to do an internal critique, but failing and consistently just going back to their own worldview and saying,
Exactly.
well, I'm dogmatically holding to that and saying, well, look, you're not adhering to my understanding.
Right. But let me also follow up too. So earlier you said that that the Christian is rational for considering premise 2 true in light of revelation, and that's absolutely correct. Butler brings that up as like the first means of justifying premise 2, but it also follows from analyzing the contradictory, to be precise. It's usually said contrary, it doesn't matter, but the alternative, autonomy, right? If you look at a worldview without the triune God, without the hypostatic union, if you look at a worldview without these doctrines, you'll soon find that it falls apart. The best example, I think personally, is the problem of the one and the many. But like we were just discussing in that other server, when Vincent brought up the problem of induction, what that serves to do is to sort of lengthen the transcendental argument to show how premise 2 plays out, or to show how premise 2 is justified. So in other words, if autonomy were possible, then there would be an autonomous answer to the problem of induction. There is no autonomous answer to the problem of induction. Therefore, autonomy is impossible. And that justifies premise 2. Or my favorite argument, if autonomy were possible, then there would be a non-Trinitarian answer to the problem of the one and the many. There is no such thing. There cannot be, in the nature of the case.
Right. I think one response to that might actually be to disagree with the first statement there, with the first premise, I guess, which is that somebody might say, well, no, actually, there's another Trinitarian God, not the Christian God, that is able to explain these things. So we could have an autonomous view in the sense that it's apart from the Christian God, but it's still Trinitarian, and so it still accounts for the problem of the one and the many. How do you think that falls short?
So I think that's to the benefit of the Christian in the conversation, because then he can point out, okay, before, just as a preface, before I follow up to that, notice that as these problems are brought up, you keep coming closer and closer to Christianity. You keep borrowing more and more capital from my worldview to try to answer these problems.
Yeah, their God they posit usually ends up looking just like the Christian God.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what a coincidence. But yeah, if they want to posit the Christian God, they're not going to be able to stop at the Trinity. Okay, so he's a Trinitarian God. What about the human condition? Does this God reveal himself? If so, where is his revelation? at that point they're in real trouble, because I mean, there's very few historical texts that you can appeal to and say, look, here's the revelation of my God. And of those texts, there's there is no plausible case to be made that look, over here in the Quran, there's such a reasonable worldview that's presented.
So often what the unbeliever will say then is, well, what about a God who is like the Christian God in a lot of aspects, but is somehow different or distinct? Maybe he has the Trinitarian property, for example, but he's not the Christian God.
I mean, I think that's for the respectful unbeliever, that is probably the exact route they're going to take. That's the route that's usually taken in my experience. Is, well, what happens if I just borrow a bunch of capital from you and then change this one thing? Well, first of all, then you've just abandoned ship. You're no longer defending your worldview anymore. You're saying, okay, well, what if I just speculate about trying to follow a God that's very much like the Christian God, but not really? Can we just be honest for a second with how ridiculous that is? Like, that's sophistry.
Well, it is sophistry, but it is almost just another type of pluralism, where they're just saying, well, why don't we just assume that all of these worldviews that have this, some sort of God are plausible?
Yes. See, the sad fact of the matter is, I'm not sure how a person can do this. So I think some people that I've talked to are honest about this, but for the most part, they're just dishonest, because they will pull the pay no heed to the man behind the curtain routine when you point out, aren't you just assuming that we can just speculate God however we wish? Which is, of course, exactly what they're assuming.